For over 100 years, engineers built lighter towers while ignoring a stronger design spun fresh in the garden each night, finally measured in 2017. By the end, you'll see the exact order a spider follows in total darkness, and why a space agency copied it. It is 3 in the morning, and a common garden spider hangs in empty air between 2 branches with no web beneath it. Within the hour, there will be a near-perfect wheel, dozens of spokes wide, built entirely in the dark. Here is the part that stops people. The spider cannot see what it does, and builds the whole thing by touch, measuring each thread with its legs. No blueprint, no practice run, no fixing a mistake once the silk is out, and by dawn it eats most of the web and starts over. That nightly perfection is exactly why a team of engineers took these webs apart, thread by thread. What they found is stranger than the web itself. They were not naturalists chasing a curiosity. They were structural engineers, and they believed this ordinary garden spider was solving a problem their own field had not cracked: how to build something light, strong, and able to survive damage without a single wasted strand. The web you walk through on a misty morning is, by their measurements, one of the most efficient structures ever recorded. And the way it gets built, the order, the sequence, the logic in the dark, is the real case file. The animal at the center of this file is the European garden spider, Araneus diadematus, the crossback spider common across gardens, hedgerows, and window frames throughout the northern hemisphere. The first careful records of how it builds are surprisingly old. In the 18th and 19th centuries, naturalists sat for hours sketching the same sequence again and again, and noticed something no one could explain. The order never changed. The spider always began the same way: a single thread let loose into the wind until it snagged on something across the gap. It would walk that first bridge line, reinforce it, then drop a loose thread that it pulled into a Y, fixing the center point of the whole web before a single spoke existed. From that hub, it laid the spokes outward like the ribs of a wheel. Every spider, everywhere, in the same order. By the 20th century, researchers realized the sequence was so consistent it could be written down as a set of rules, almost like code. And here is the promise of this file. What happens near the end of the build is the part no one expected, a step where the spider destroys part of its own work on purpose. But first, the orderly build had to survive the people who were certain it meant nothing at all. For a long time, the orderly build was written off as nothing more than blind instinct, a fixed reflex no more interesting than a heartbeat. If the web looked designed, skeptics argued, that was a trick of our eyes. The spider was simply running a mechanical loop with no sensitivity to what it was making. Others went further and claimed the geometry did not really matter, that a web was a web, and any tangle of sticky thread would catch a fly just as well. That idea collapsed in 1948, when a German pharmacologist named Peter Witt tried something odd. He dosed garden spiders with caffeine and other drugs, then photographed the webs they built. The webs came out visibly wrecked, lopsided, gapped, the spacing between threads ruined. If the build were a rigid, meaningless reflex, the drug should have changed nothing. Instead, the pattern was so sensitive that a trace of caffeine in the spider's body showed up as a broken geometry you could photograph and measure. The web, it turned out, was not a mindless loop at all. It was a precise process that recorded the internal state of the animal building it. But proving the pattern was sensitive did not prove it was clever. To make the engineering case, someone had to measure the finished web against the numbers, and the numbers were not kind to the skeptics. A garden spider builds a full wheel-shaped web in under an hour, in the dark, and never redraws a line. When engineers recorded the build frame by frame, the order was fixed and startlingly logical. First the frame and the spokes, often more than 25 of them, anchored to a central hub that sets the tension before any glue exists. Then, from the hub, the spider lays a loose, dry spiral outward, a temporary scaffold with no stickiness at all. At the rim it reverses, laying the sticky capture spiral inward, and eats the dry scaffold as it goes, reusing the silk. The finished trap stands on a skeleton the spider builds only to destroy: maximum web, minimum thread. That last move stunned the people studying it. The spider is not just spinning a net. It is running a construction sequence that recycles its own scaffolding, the way a bridge crew strips away temporary supports once the span can hold itself. And it does all of this by feel, in near total blindness, adjusting the spacing of the sticky spiral to within a fraction of a millimeter using nothing but the length of its own legs as a ruler. The regularity is not decoration. It is the load-bearing math of the trap, and it repeats, web after web, night after night. The independent confirmation came from the least likely place, orbit. In 1973, NASA carried 2 garden orb weavers aboard the Skylab station to test whether a spider stripped of gravity, the force its whole build seemed to depend on, could still make a web. The first attempts were messy, but within days the spiders adjusted and spun webs that were recognizably orb-shaped, following the same fixed sequence they used on Earth, only recalibrated for weightlessness. The test was repeated in 2011, when 2 orb-weaving spiders flew to the International Space Station and again built ordered webs in microgravity, filmed around the clock. This mattered because it ruled out the easy explanations. The build order was not something the spider learned, or copied, or worked out fresh each time from the pull of gravity. It was carried inside the animal, an inherited construction program robust enough to run in an environment no spider had faced in 400 million years of evolution. Back on Earth, a second confirmation was arriving from the materials labs. When physicists measured single strands of the dragline silk that forms the spokes, they found a fiber that, ounce for ounce, rivaled or beat steel for toughness while stretching far more before it broke. 2 separate fields, orbit and the laboratory, had reached the same verdict from opposite directions. Cut a thread in a garden spider's web, and the whole net should sag and fail, but it barely flinches. In 2012, a team at MIT put real spider silk and real webs through the numbers to find out why. Ordinary materials share a load evenly, so one break spreads stress everywhere and the structure unzips. Spider silk does the opposite. As a single thread is pushed, it first stiffens, then suddenly softens and gives way, sacrificing itself before the strain can reach its neighbors. So damage stays local. You lose one thread, or a small patch, and the rest of the wheel holds and keeps working. A garden spider had solved, by instinct, a failure problem that human engineers design entire buildings to avoid. That is the finding that moved this out of biology and into engineering offices. The nightly build order, hub, spokes, dry scaffold, sticky spiral, is essentially a recipe for a maximum strength net using the least possible material, one that fails gracefully instead of all at once. Groups designing lightweight cargo nets, tension structures, and deployable frames that must unfold in space have studied that exact sequence, because a structure that packs small, opens on its own, and survives local damage is precisely what a spider builds before dawn. The consensus now is quiet but firm. The garden spider is not decorating the hedge. It is running one of the most efficient construction programs in nature, and we are still reverse engineering it. Here is what this case file cannot close. Every night the spider throws the finished web away, eats it, and builds the whole thing again from nothing. The bridge, the hub, the spokes, the scaffold it destroys, the spiral it keeps, with no memory of a plan and no way to see its own work. We can copy the geometry. We can measure the silk. We can write the build order down as a set of rules. But we still cannot say how an animal with a brain smaller than a grain of sand runs that program flawlessly, in the dark, and then does it all over again tomorrow night.